inside curve. It took 2 straight milling machines for milling the inside facing cone. On here for milling this part. It took 2 straight milling machines for across the back of the cone. I won't read all this, I'm a little bit too slow. But at any rate, there were 12 machining operations on this part, requiring 22 separate milling machines. On the lock I'm passing around, a lock plate. This lock plate where the hammer is attached, where the screw is attached, just that plate. That required a total of 31 separate machines and 14 machining operations. And the same is true for every part that you see there, whether they're talking about the screws, the little tumblers, the sears in the lock. Every one of those operations required machine tools and even the manufacture of the trigger guard, the trigger, the swivels, the barrel bands. Every one of those pieces required a number of machine tools and a variety of machining operations. Again, when the South acquired the machine tools from Harper's Ferry, they had 2 schools of thought as to what to do with them. One school of thought centered on what we might call centralization. The other school concentrated on dispersion. Now, the proponents of dispersion said, hey, look, what do we have? All these milling machines. There's hundreds of milling machines. Why don't we send some here, send some there, send some down south, and set up armories close to the various armors, close to the various armies. So we have in Richmond, armory to support Lee's army. We can have one to support Braxton Bragg's army. We can have one farther south. And by doing that, we'll have much shorter shipping lines. We won't have to transport stuff so far because Confederate railroads, even at the beginning of the Civil War, were in pretty sad shape. The other school of thought said, no, we can't do that. We don't have enough equipment to scatter it around. We have to centralize it because we only have a limited number of trained mechanics, and we only have a limited number of resources. So these 2 schools of thought sort of battled back and forth for a period of time. And a superintendent of all Confederate armies, a fellow by the name of James Henry Burton, had to explain to the Confederacy just how arms were made and why that seeming redundancy of machine tools, of milling machines, really were needed, because every operation that we've seen here, like one I mentioned on the lock plate and on the hammer, required a slight operation. So his idea was, once you set up your armory with all these tools in place, and you have the holders and the jigs and the cutters and the mills all set up, then all you have to do is pass the part from one operation to the next, and there's no changing of dies and tools and so on. Once you have fewer than required number of milling machines in an operation, then to make those parts, you've got to stop, take out one set of holders, take out one set of jigs, put in others, continue, and that continual changing of these holders and milling machines aren't ever going to be adjusted exactly quite the same. So now you're going to destroy interchangeability because these machines aren't going to be cutting the parts to exactly the same tolerances. So he argued for centralization. So sort of see how these machine tools sort of play into they maintain those standards? How did they maintain standards so that they knew that down in Harper's Ferry, they were making parts that were going to interchange with guns we're making here in Springfield? They did it by, when they adopted a model, for example here, when they decided, okay, we're going to arm our troops now with this model 1842 musket. They would sit down and they would manufacture by hand one or two of these guns called pattern rifles or pattern arms. And that all the arms that were going to be manufactured would have to be of the same tolerances of their pattern arm, which was made by hand. In addition to making that pattern arm, one or two in each armory, they had a whole series of gauges. I'll pass this around so you can see. These gauges are made out of hardened steel, and the parts that they were manufacturing would be measured and applied against these gauges to ensure standardization and interchangeability. Pass it around. I'll start here. To give you an idea of all the different gauges they would have, they'd have a gauge to make sure that the muzzle was the right diameter, the caliber was the right diameter, the lock plate was of proper shape, and so on. And those, to manufacture those gauges, there'd be 2 or 3 sets in every armory. It would take some time to do. I want to point this out because critics of my good friend here, James Wolfe Ripley, have ripped him pretty badly for not adopting a breech-loading arm or a repeating arm like the Spencer carbine or the Sharps carbine, what have you. And they say, look, these guns were around for a while. They had proven themselves during the 1850s in bleeding Kansas, when Kansas was torn apart between the Free Soilers and the pro-slavery people. They were fighting. They say, there were Sharps rifles used out there. Maybe you've heard or remember about Beecher's Bibles. Henry Ward Beecher from Plymouth Church in Brooklyn sent out a load of Sharps rifles under the title Bibles on the crate. And they point to this and say, oh, these guns were used in Kansas and they proved themselves. There's no reason why Ripley couldn't have adopted them for the Union Army. One problem is the total number of Sharps that were out in Kansas probably didn't exceed 1,000. And they were in the hands of civilians. And not all of them were used in any kind of a combat situation. And secondly, some armed civilians fighting among themselves is not a laboratory experiment for armies using a weapon. And thirdly, nobody ever said that the Sharps rifle wasn't a good rifle. The problem was you couldn't manufacture it in the quantities needed to arm the Union Army. But think about it, what we've been saying here about the total number of machine tools, the commitment to making arms with interchangeable parts. The jumping over into a time of war to go from a musket to make a Sharps rifle would have totally exceeded the capability of Springfield Armory to retool to make that arm in any kind of numbers for the Union Army. Secondly, if they had abandoned the muzzleloader, tools of which they were able to manufacture, and gone to a Sharps or to a Spencer, for example, or some of the other guns that these historians criticize Ripley for not adopting, the ability to make a pattern arm, as we've seen, was the basis for any kind of arm was adopted, to make a pattern arm, to make the gauges coming around for that, to meet interchangeable parts. How long would it have taken to have done that? Meanwhile, we've got a war in our hands, and we're trying to manufacture a totally new arm, according to the Ripley's critics. I don't think it could have been done. A lot of the two major critics of Ripley and his decision to stay with War, came out about 1954. And another fellow, Alan Nevins, one of his Civil War books, they're as large a critic of Ripley as anyone. I'll just focus on these two fellows and what they suggested. Bruce said, if the Ordnance Department hadn't been run by a lot of old hidebound old fogies that for whom a new idea was anathema, I didn't sort of talk that way about these guys. If they hadn't been that way, they'd been more forward thinking. They could have adopted the Spencer carbine, Spencer rifle, Spencer carbine, which was a repeater in the Spencer. The magazine was in through the stock. It would hold 7 shots, and you could load one in the chamber. So you had an 8-shot weapon there with the Spencer. It also used a metallic cartridge. And Robert Bruce said if they had started back about in the late 1850s to adopt this weapon, convert the armory to make them, by the time of the Civil War, they would have had facilities to make much more modern arm. They would have armed the Union, and he was on to say, the North would have had a monopoly on that arm. So that we went to the Civil War came, the South would still be fooling around with muzzle loaders, and we'd have this new modern Spencer, and the war would have been over by 1863, and there was a lot less lives. Pretty good argument, except to me, he overlooks a couple things. In 1857, we had a panic, which was their term for depression. Government was cutting back on expenses. So I doubt very much if the Ordnance Corps could have been convinced the House of Representatives and the Senate to spend vast amounts of money to retool their armories, Harper's Ferry and Springfield, to make a new arm. It wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to spend that kind of money. Roger.
What was the European armies, like the French and the Germans, using by this point in time?
At that time, Britain was using the model 1853 Enfield,
which we saw a lot of them.
Which we bought a lot of, which is another reason by sticking with a muzzleloader, then we were able to import a muzzleloader from England and buy up a lot of secondary arms from Europe, like the Belgian weapons, the Austrian rifles, because even though they were stock back, they were still the same type of arm that we were manufacturing ourselves.
How about the French and the Germans? Were they still muzzle?
The Germans were using, to a large extent, an arm called the Drace, or the needle gun. It was a bolt-action breech loader. One of Ripley's critics, a fellow by the name of Shannon, wrote his criticism in 1928, and he said we should have adopted this arm, this bolt-action Drace. Problem with it was, let's see if I can implement something here. May I roll this up just a second? The Drace used essentially a paper mache cartridge. The bullet was here was the powder, and it had a very long needle. That's why sometimes you refer to this gun as the needle gun. Its firing pin was an extremely long needle that penetrated this paper mache up through the powder, and in the base of the bullet was the primer. So this long needle would go through, hit that primer in the base of the bullet, that would ignite the powder, and the bullet would go out. That needle was extremely fragile. So these arms the Germans were using, the Drace, were a early breech-loading arm, but a very, very fragile type of arm. So I hope that maybe sort of answers your question there on that. Yes?
So where were they getting, all right, a couple questions. Number one, where?
Oh, by the way, if you have questions, don't wait till the question and answer, just ask them right as they occur to you.
For all these parts, where were they getting the raw materials?
The raw material early on in the 1820, 1815, 1820s and so on, Harper's Ferry got its iron from iron foundries in central Pennsylvania, around Huntington and so on. They'd make these arms, and then they would, bars of steel, they would bend them, so they would fit around the neck of a mule. And they transport them to the canals, and the canals would go down to Philadelphia and around to Harper's Ferry.
So they were making steel in large quantities?
Well, they were making iron. Steel was kind of a new metal. They had some steel, but they really were still making arms out of iron. Yes, sir.
So now, where was the South manufacturing their raw materials, or where did they get their raw
The
materials?
South.
I mean, they didn't have that, what, Birmingham?
Well, yeah. What time of period you're talking
Well,
about?
pre-Civil War.
Pre-Civil War. I don't think there was much arms manufactured in the South.
Well, if they only had, is that the only armory they had when they got to Harper's Ferry, or did they have other armories?
They had art. The difference here between an armory and an arsenal. There were a lot of arsenals in the South. An arsenal is where arms are stored. An armory is where they're manufactured. Now, every armory had an arsenal because they had to put the arms they manufactured someplace until they shipped them out. But an arsenal is where arms were pretty much stored and distributed. Now, there were those in the South, and of course they had some small machinery there for manufacturing and or for repairs primarily. But there were no major armories in the South prior to the Civil War, to my knowledge. Yeah,
Was Tredegear a wartime creation?
well,
then?
Tredegear, yeah, they manufactured, to the arms that they manufactured were heavy ordnance.
More cannon
Yeah,
than
yeah.
small arms?
Yeah. When the state of Virginia in the early 1800s had a state armory, and then it sort of fell into disuse. But when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, this of course had the South pretty well upset. They restored the Virginia armory, built it, boosted it up. So by the time the Civil War came along, the Virginia armory was pretty well up and running. And that's where they sent, when they captured Harper's Ferry, there were the musket works that made muskets, smoothbore muskets. And they were built along the Potomac River. Right there at Harper's Ferry, the Potomac River and the Shenandoah come together, kind of like Pittsburgh, where the two rivers come together. Along the Shenandoah River, they had the Hall Rifle Works. John Hall was there making rifles. So when Harper's Ferry was burned, they shipped all the musket-making machinery to Richmond and the Richmond, Virginia Armory, and they sent all the rifle-making tools to Fayetteville, North Carolina. It was kind of the split. Everybody was saying about how they had the centralization and the decentralization schools of thought. Well, they kind of compromised and they split the material that way. So the arms were manufactured then in Richmond and in Fayetteville. Dave?
You know, in the area of southwestern Virginia, and in the areas just south of Lexington, there were a lot of iron forges, very similar to the iron forges up in Center County and Huntington area of central Pennsylvania. So they had an iron supply, and a lot of that went right to Tredegar.
Okay.
Along the James River in Richmond, and their resources not only were iron ore but also lead from that area.
Okay. Yeah, I don't mean to sort of say that the South didn't have any of these resources, but as far as I understood this gentleman's question, as far as having like an armory of the equivalent of Springfield or Harper's Ferry, they didn't until they got into the war. And then they built a very, very large armory in Macon, Georgia. However, they didn't get it really built in time. The war was over by the time they ever really got it built. It never, even though it was a gigantic armory, it never really manufactured very many arms because they were trying to get parts and so on from England and to my way of thinking, I don't know, this is maybe a little beside the point, but I don't know what it possessed the Confederacy to build this gigantic armory dedicated to making the 1853 muzzle-loading Enfield. It was kind of like a big white elephant, as far as I can see. And here again, here's another point I'm sort of diverting, but they criticized Ripley for staying with a muzzleloader. But there was no one in the Confederacy arguing for any other arm than the muzzle-loading musket or rifle. Nobody down there was saying, oh, we gotta go to a Spencer, we gotta go to a Sharps, we gotta go to this, gotta go to that. They advocated the muzzle loader for the infantry, yes.
On the other hand, the North was the major industrial power. They would seem to have more of the luxury of trying innovative things, while the South was scrambling to have anything at all.
Well, that's true. And one of those critics I was mentioning in the, I think it was that guy Bruce and Lincoln and the Tools of War. He argued, he said it was Ripley's job to be talking to anybody who had any possible idea of developing a more powerful arm. He said you should have been talking to all these different guys who had all these different proposals. Ridiculous. Because in the 1850s, the Ordnance Corps did exactly that. Anybody who had any screwball idea for a new arm, a steam cannon, a stink bomb, all these guys were coming up through the Secretary of War saying, I got this great idea for a new weapon. And then he'd say, okay, you guys in Gordon, you guys down there in Washington, Arsenal, you guys up in Springfield, talk to this guy and see what he has. And invariably, what the guys were proposing was a pipe bomb. Was nothing at all. And the Army spent their time. Now, when the war came along, they didn't have time to hold these guys' hands. So again, the Ripley's critics sort of criticize him for doing stuff, in my mind, this simply doesn't make sense. The Ordnance Corps only had 60 ordnance officers when the Civil War came up. And they certainly didn't have the manpower to sit down with some guy who was proposing a centrifugal steam cannon and replace it. But
Didn't they have an incident, what was it, the 1840s or 50s with artillery where they were testing a high-powered naval cannon and nearly blew up the president and most of the cabinet?
yeah, in 1842, it was known as the Peacemaker. This was a large cast gun, and the naval officer named Stockton, California is named after him. He was involved in this. But this big gun, they took it out, and John Tyler was the president at the time. They took this gun out in the Potomac, and they fired it, and it burst. This happened a lot with cast cannons because of the way in which they cast them. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about the Reading works, but maybe we can introduce that now. Yes, sir.
Was there a lot of saber or bayonet contact?
There were a number of bayonet charges, bayonet battles during the Civil War. One comes to mind was at a battle on the peninsula, Battle of Fair Oaks, and General Sumner, who was in charge of the Second Corps at that point, had a bayonet charge against the Confederates to push them back. It was a bayonet battle right in part of Chancellorsville when Sedgwick, who was still at Fredericksburg, advanced against Jubal Early and brought his troops up there. He had a bayonet charge. Those are two that quickly come to mind as to where they were.
Chamberlain, Gettysburg.
Sabers were, yeah, sabers were used pretty much. I know there's in the 1864 there at Cedar Creek, there was some cavalry activity where sabers were involved. The South, Jeb Stuart has a testimony where he really endorsed the saber. He said, oh, it gives a great land, great spirit in the saber. At this point, I don't know whether he really believed that, or since the South didn't have really very many reliable carbines, he championed the saber because that was the weapon that they had. So I'm not really sure, but yeah, the saber and cavalry charges were used pretty frequently. Where cavalry was fighting on horseback in the traditional manner. A lot of times cavalry would dismount and fight with their carbines, but where they were horseback in encounters, the saber was used pretty much. I guess I don't know.
One question. Now, I'm understanding right then, the main U.S. arsenal is Springfield, and for the Confederates, it's Tredegar for artillery and Fayetteville, North Carolina for small arms?
Well, Fayetteville at the beginning, but you don't discount the Richmond Armory, the Virginia Armory at Richmond. They manufactured quite a few arms.
And that's separate of Tredegar?
Yes, yes. And then in Macon, Georgia, they were trying to develop this very large armory, but as I say, it never really got off the ground. Sherman was down there and captured it before they ever really got into production. All the machine tools that they were going to put in were coming from England, and they got intercepted in the blockade. So that big armory was nothing but a big expense for the Confederacy, and never really manufactured very many.
Did the Federals expand much on artillery or rifles beyond Springfield, or was that like one massive armory for almost the whole Federal war effort?
Well, that was the main armory for the whole Federal war effort, although they contracted out to a great number of private manufacturers. Colt manufactured an arm. Colt's baby was a revolving rifle. Remember, the Colt revolver was 6 shots. Well, they just took that same mechanism, put a long barrel on it in the stock, and it was a revolving rifle. But they also manufactured a musket very similar to the 1861-1863 Springfield musket. Colt manufactured for the Army. And there was Providence Arms Company in Providence, Rhode Island, manufactured a lot of arms, a couple companies in Philadelphia. And there were a lot of companies that made arms, however, they didn't have barrel-making facilities. Some of the larger armories would make barrels and send them out to these smaller armories who would make the stocks and the locks and so on. So while Springfield was the primary arsenal, it was arms were produced by a wide variety of subsidiary countries, plus the imports we mentioned from England. By the way, talking about the South and manufacturing, this arm, when it left Springfield in 1852, the barrel was about 8 inches longer. This is certainly an 1842 musket, but in its present version, it was cut back to a carbine. Now, I'm not sure just where this happened, but best I can figure, this arm was probably carried by a Yankee soldier on the peninsula in 1862. He might have been killed, but the arm itself was probably damaged up here somewhere in the barrel. Maybe he got hit by a musket ball or something. This arm was taken, and I suspect only the Confederacy would have spent the time to do this. But this arm was taken, and it was shortened into a carbine. No, they didn't take some guy with a hacksaw and saw the barrel off. What they did, this is the original muzzle, bayonet lug, the original muzzle. It was cut off, the damaged part was cut out. Then back on the barrel, this was turned down a few thousandths of an inch on a machine, on a lathe. The muzzle was opened up a few thousandths of an inch on the lathe, and then the muzzle was flipped over this part and silver soldered. If you take this first barrel band off with a magnifying glass, you can see a very, very, very fine seam where these two parts were joined together. Now that required, and the stock itself was shortened, the ramrod was shortened. That required quite a bit of skilled machining, skilled mechanics. So that's why I suspect it was probably done in Richmond. We sometimes come away with the idea that the South had no manufacturing or machining capability. We can sometimes think that they didn't have enough imagination to screw a nut on a bolt. That's really not quite right. They just didn't have enough of these people. One of the problems with Southern manufacturing of arms, they granted very, very few deferments. Even though you might be a skilled mechanic, they still wanted you to be out there in the trenches carrying a musket. But what they would do from time to time, when arms production really was critical, they'd go around to different regiments and say, hey, you guys in here have any mechanical background? They say, yeah, I. Well, they would give them a 6-month release, and they'd send these guys to the armories. And now then, these guys are in the armories, and they got to learn how to work the machining tools, and you can imagine some of their first productions isn't going to be very good. They by the time they get skilled, their 6 months deferment's over. They gotta go back to carry a musket, and now they're replaced with another gang of guys. So the Confederate, to my mind, the Confederate manpower policy kind of worked against them in this way. If they'd taken 1,000 guys, the size of maybe one regiment, who were experienced machinists, and just take them out of the army, put them in these shops, probably wouldn't have won the war, but they could have produced a much greater number of more quality arms. Lee writes to Gorgas, who's the head of the Southern Ordnance Corps, and he said, wouldn't it be better if you made a few good carbines instead of a whole lot of inferior ones? So, I mean, and Gorgas had a big job in his hand, and he did a great job, but just the manufacturing and the manpower that the South had kind of worked against them in the ability to produce anything of real quantity on a large scale. That's the thing. They did make good stuff, but certainly not enough to arm the armies that they had. They had to really rely on battlefield pickups such as this, importing arms from England, and what manufacturing that they had. So, coming back to Ripley's critics, one guy, as I said, Bruce, saying how they should have started back in the 1850s to convert over to the Spencer. Now, Alan Nevins says, okay, I'll concede. Maybe we had to start the Civil War with muzzle loaders, but at some point, maybe by 1863, they should have cut over and manufactured an arm such as the Spencer or the Sharps or something along this line. Well, again, as we've seen, these arms, to fit into the way the armories work, they would have had to have sat down and made a pattern arm for, let's say, they decided to adopt the Spencer. They would have had to make a couple pattern arms. And if they were going to make them in a variety of manufacturing facilities, they would have had to have a couple pattern arms for each manufacturing facilities. They would have had to have a couple sets of those elaborate dies and passing around. How long would that have taken? What are they going to do in the meantime? So the idea of cutting over from one type of a manufactured product to another, when you got a war on your hands, it's a pretty big operation. Now, we didn't do that, so we don't know really what might have happened had Ripley adopted what Alan Nevins says he should have done, converted to a new arm in 1863. It never happens, we don't know what happened. But there's, yes,
Tom, you make a compelling argument in that respect to do all that. But the excuse, and I can't recall the source anymore, the excuse that has been attributed to the Ordnance Bureau has been not so much the difficulty in changing over manufacturing, developing the pattern arm, but they complained about the breech loaders and the repeating rifles, that it would be a waste of ammunition.
this is very true. The Army, for the longest time, always worried about the soldier in the field using up his ammunition faster than it could be supplied to him. And it was not until 1937, when the Army adopted the M1 Garand, that they finally gave up the idea of wasting ammunition. When they went in 1892, and we adopted the first bolt-action rifle, the 30-40 Craig Jorgensen. They adopted that because it could be fired as a single shot, but if the enemy charged, you had a little magazine of, I forget, maybe 5 rounds that could be fired. But the way to fire the arm was single shot. You only used your magazine in a tight situation. When they manufactured and got rid of the Craig Jorgensen and adopted the 1903 Springfield, the Springfield had what was called a magazine cutoff. So you could put a 5-shot clip in, but you would fire the gun single shot, and again, until the enemy started charging you and you needed rapid fire. It wasn't until 1936 they finally got the idea that they could manufacture enough ammunition that it wasn't a problem. So that was a real hang-up to the military. But you got to remember, what are we talking about? We're trying to supply guys in the field with horse-drawn wagons over rough terrain, and it was a difficult situation to supply. Well, they might have been wrong, but they were erring on the side of caution. And very often there be many accounts where units ran out of ammunition, they had to pull back, new regiments were put in with cartridge. Yeah,
Now, that would have been between the railhead or the port head and the Army one of it. Up until that point, you could use trains or ships to move your large quantity.
Yeah, but when you're in like fighting in the wilderness, for example, you know, where you're pretty far away from any kind of thing other than wagon transportation, that was.
On the other hand, I think during the siege of Petersburg, Grant had brought his munitions ashore at City Point and had a rail spur that carried it up to his armies once they were stationary.
Yeah, but even so, suppose this is the battlefield here, you know, we're here along where the campus is, and down there by 422 is your railhead. You know, you still got about a mile or so to bring that stuff up on horse and wagons, you know, so it's, and that was another reason why there was a reluctance to go to a cartridge arm, where you had the primer, the powder, and the bullet all in one. They simply did not know what was going to happen when you're going to haul ammunition in a springless wagon over a rutted road some distance with it juggling and pounding, whether or not that primer might not set off the ammunition. It didn't happen, but they didn't know that in 1860 and 61. They had enough time to experiment. Yeah, Darryl.
What was the cost of the mini ball or the bullet they were using? Was that a factor too, that they didn't want to go to a repeating rifle? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
That's another point. I'm not sure what the cost was, but the Spencer used a rimfire. If you're familiar with rimfires, like the 22 long rifle, the primer is in the rim, and Spencer used a cartridge like that because it was very, very new, and a lot of the companies making those cartridges didn't make them to the right tolerances, and they were using that arm to some extent in the Western campaigns. You read stories where the copper jacket jammed in a gun and all that kind of stuff. So cartridge ammunition was a new thing then. They didn't have like we have today. You want to buy a box of 30-06 ammunition, you don't have to worry whether it's Remington, Federal, or what. The tolerances or such are going to work. But back in the day when this was a new development, not all ammunition manufacturing was the same. So that was a problem too for the Army. Ripley was probably a pretty hard guy to work with. I mean, he's kind of a hero of mine, but if I hadn't worked for him, I probably would have been madder. Because he was cantankerous, he wasn't easy to get along with. And he wasn't always honest in his arguments. He didn't want to adopt this, and didn't want to do that, and he wasn't always honest in his arguments. But I really believe, looking at the conditions in terms of manufacturing, that he was correct in staying with the muzzleloader, an arm which he had a reasonable expectation of being able to manufacture or supply to the soldiers in the field. Early on, guys, when the war began, guys were enlisting in their regiments in far in excess of the Army being able to supply them. That's where the Pennsylvania Reserves, which was as fine a group of regiments as on either side during the Civil War, as far as I'm concerned. They were recruited to Pennsylvania, and then the War Department said, no, let those guys go home because we don't have enough uniforms, we don't have enough guns for them, you know, we can't absorb them fast enough. And Andrew Curtin thought, well, wait a minute, you know, these guys are enlisted, I'm not going to send them home. Besides, we've got that long border with Maryland, and that's kind of a questionable state, so we better keep these guys in. So they had the term Pennsylvania Reserves, and sometimes people think of reserves, they were some sort of a campfire girl operation aggressive group of 13 regiments. So these are the problems that sort of faced Ripley, and I think by his decision to stay with the muzzleloader, he was able to then import a very quality arm, the 1853 Enfield. He was able to make use of lesser quality arms from Austria and Belgium and different places. But at least it was a gun in the hands of a soldier that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Yes?
You're in the early part of the war, how much better the Southern cavalry was than the Northern cavalry. My question is, am I correct in saying that because they, and I can't remember whether it was the Sharps or the Spencer that the United States cavalry adopted, did that have anything to do with the improvement of the federal cavalry?
I see what you're saying. I would say the improvement of the Union cavalry was probably more developmental. The arm wasn't quite the key factor. The Spencer came out with a rifle, and then after Gettysburg, they were induced to producing the carbine. The carbine came out in I think October of 1863. Essentially, what they did was cut 8 inches off the barrel of the rifle. Now, in doing that, they greatly reduced the muzzle energy. As a rule of thumb, say as a rule of thumb, for every inch of barrel, you'd get another 100 feet of velocity. So by cutting a barrel off 8 inches, they effectively lost 800 feet of velocity. And killing power is a combination of the weight of the bullet and the velocity at which it hits you. The Spencer carbine, although it was the darling of the cavalry, they loved the gun, it really was an underpowered arm. And a lot of battles where the Spencer carbine was used against the Confederacy, the Confederates won. Battle of Hawes Shop in 1864, the Union cavalry were armed with Spencers. The Confederate cavalry were armed with shotguns and Enfields, and because they had a longer range, they won the battle. The Battle of Olustee in just outside of Jacksonville, Florida, in February 1864. The Union Army was armed with Spencer rifles, but that arm didn't give them victory. The victory went to the Confederacy. So, yes, sir.
Why did they decide to stay with the smoothbore?
Well, they did. They adopted the rifle in 1855. As I say, this was the last official arm that was smoothbore, 1842. This was manufactured at least up until 1855 when they adopted the 1855 plus. That was the one with the Maynard primer, where you had like a roll of kids' 4th of July caps that were used in addition to or as a replacement of the percussion cap. And that was the first arm. That arm was adopted by Jefferson Davis when he was Secretary of War. That was the first rifle arm that was produced. A lot of smoothbores were used in the Civil War simply because we needed them. They were around and we needed them. But officially, the Army adopted a rifle or rifle musket in 1855.
Now, from what I remember before the advent of the mini ball, your big problem with a rifle as opposed to a smoothbore was loading rate.
Right.
And the time it took you to really ram home one rifle ball, you might have 2 or 3 smoothbore balls coming your way. So if they got close enough to actually hit you, you were really getting outshot.
Yeah.
But with the mini ball, I guess you could reload a rifle almost as fast as a smoothbore.
That's correct. The rifle, particularly the rifles that were used like by Daniel Morgan and some of his troops during the American Revolution, used a patched ball. And if some of you might be muzzleloader hunters, you're familiar with this. You have a patched ball, and you start it, take your ramrod and push it down. And because that's very slow to load, plus those rifles didn't have bayonets, so they were a marginal arm during the American Revolution. And yes, sir.
But it's no big deal to rifle a musket, a smoothbore musket, is it?
Well, it's not a big deal, but some of them were. Not a lot of smoothbore rifles were converted to rifles. Smoothbore muskets were converted to rifles. So it's not a big operation, but it is, you have to take the gun back and you have to do it.
Well, it has to be in a shop.
Right, yeah, you
But I
can't,
think
they can't do that in the field, you have to
It's
do
less
it.
than a day's work to do one.
Yeah, they did, they rifled some smoothbore muskets at Springfield. A lot of them were done by private contractors. And I don't know the numbers on it, but they did convert quite a few. Trying to into Rodney's question, a thought came, I'm just trying to, oh yeah, the idea of the mini ball. In France had colonies in North Africa. And during the American Revolution and Napoleonic Wars and so on, the idea was the army would stand up in a line in a massive fire and you'd shoot at one another. Now, you have a smoothbore, and you're a line of enemy infantry coming to me, and I'm up there and I'm aiming at barrel, and I fire my smoothbore, but the ball goes and hits Laurie by mistake. I've still inflicted a casualty. You know, so it doesn't really matter that my smoothbore is not terribly accurate. I didn't hit who I was aiming at, but I hit another enemy soldier, so I was effectively we're okay. But in North Africa, the North Africans didn't mass like that. You had one guy out there all by himself, and a guy over there all by himself. So the smoothbore muskets weren't working very well, and they adapted the rifle and the mini ball. The mini ball comes from the guy Minet, M-I-N-I-E with a angle over it, whatever, like accident cute or whatever. And so they called it the mini ball, and it was undersized. So it would slide down to the rifle barrel fairly easily because it was slightly undersized. But in its base, the base of the bullet, it had a small iron disc. And the idea was when the propellant expanded into gas, it would drive that iron disc into the lead bullet and expand it to take the rifling. So that's how it was kind of the first idea, making a ball that's slightly undersized, so it will load easy, but it will expand to grip the rifle.
Best of both worlds.
Yeah.
You get the fast reload rate and you get the accuracy of the rifle.
Right. The fellow that in that one book with the iron with the granite musket ball on it, that fellow name was James Henry Burton. He worked down at Harper's Ferry, and he designed an much improved mini ball. So that during the Civil War, their actual mini ball wasn't used. The name continued. But what they were using instead was officially known as the Harper's Ferry bullet. And after about 3 major redesigns, Burton discovered he really didn't need anything in the base of the bullet. If you made the base a certain form, the gas would be enough to expand those lead skirts. So he did away with that, with the iron plug in the bullet. It was essentially, again, the same principle, undersized so it was easy to load, and ability to expand to grip the rifle. Yes, Tom?
Tom, what actually was the caliber then of the barrel?
When they went to 1855, when they went from 69 caliber, they went down to 58 caliber. And so the official, when I say official arm, what I mean is the arm that the Ordnance Department adopted for the troops. Now, oftentimes they would, like, for example, Spencer carbines were used in the cavalry. So we used a lot of Spencers, but they weren't really an official army weapon. So I say the official arm was 58 caliber during the Civil War. And when the war was over, and they were stuck with all these smoothbores, and they converted them now to a cartridge weapon. They went down into 50 caliber, and then in the 1872 model, they went down further to the 45 caliber. But during the Civil War, the official arm was 58 caliber. Yes, sir?
When did the pistol or the revolver come on the scene?
The revolver was adopted by the first U.S. Cavalry. First U.S. Cavalry was formed in 1855. And they adopted the model, or the caliber 36 Navy Colt for the cavalry. Prior to that, they had the Dragoons. And the Dragoons had a saber, a carbine, and they would carry 2 single-shot horse pistols mounted on the saddle. But then they found, I'm a little vague on this in terms of actual dates, but they discovered that the Colt 36 caliber revolver would do everything, would be an adequate arm for the cavalry, and they adopted that at that time.
I think one of the early users of the Colt revolvers, in fact, I believe at one point they propped up Colt's business, was the Texas Rangers.
That's true,
And
yeah.
what they had was a problem, as I understood, with Comanches. They were going out with single-shot pistols and rifles.
You're
They'd
right.
fire at the Comanches, maybe hit a couple. The Comanches would ride in and shower them with, bunches of arrows. So what you get is you get these repeaters, 5-shot repeaters, and all of a sudden when the Comanche come in close to shower arrows, the Texas Rangers are blasting them with lots of lead.
You're right, I forgot about that. The Colt Dragoon was a very big, heavy model, and they
went to the 44 caliber,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, they were- but they were big and heavy, and they discovered that they could do just about as well with a smaller 36 caliber Colt Navy. So they were adopted. And then during the Civil War, they were using the Colt Army, which was 44 caliber. Still some Navy 36 calibers around. And it's kind of funny when the U.S. 1st and 2nd Cavalry were formed, those regiments were formed in 1855. The shoulder arms that they carried very quite a bit. They didn't have the same arm in all companies of the 1st Cavalry or 2nd Cavalry. Some had the Sharp, some had a couple off the wall. And those of you, if you remember some of those at the Civil War Roundtable a month or so ago, and Ed Ewing brought in that shoulder-fired pistol, kind of a clumsy, kludgy thing. Well, some of the regiments were armed with those things. So, our Army was sort of always been a big challenge for getting enough guns. Even during the Second World War, with the M1 Garand, which we adopted in 1937, we couldn't make enough of them. And in Guadalcanal, 1942, the Marines were still fighting with the bolt-action Springfield. Couldn't make enough.
Well, there was another rifle some of those Marines had too. It was semi-automatic.
Well, that was another reason why the Marines were a little bit delayed. It wasn't always production. It was a political thing because they had a Marine officer by the name of Johnson who came up with an arm that was kind of a competitor to the Garand.
Right.
And if you can imagine such a thing as politics, the Army, the government. So politics was involved in there. Should be adopted Garand, adopted Johnson. The Marine Corps really wanted to, and the Navy wanted to go with the Johnson, which was a pretty good arm.
And it was the Marine Raiders that carried that one into 2 of the other islands there.
Okay.
You know?
I'm just off the top of my head, I can't remember when Marines finally got the M1, but I'd say at Guadalcanal in the fall of 42, they were still carrying it. And production problems had a little bit to do with that.
Now, what do you think about the concept of some units using the other weapons when they were available? Wilder's Brigade, the cavalry with their Spencers.
Well, I think that was justifiable, and that was okay as long as you could supply them with the ammunition that they would need. But I think it went a long way to prove and to offset some of the concerns that they had about these weapons. Some of Ripley's arguments were disingenuous, but generally they really didn't know how durable some of these repeating arms are going to be in the service. You had all our Winchesters, Henry, with a tubular magazine. Well, that was just a rather thin tube. And how's that going to stand up in combat? It's going to get dinged, it's going to get damaged. And what about having a bunch of bullets, nose to tail, in there, rattling around? And maybe that'll settle. And there were examples from accidental discharges in the Spencer of bullets going off in the tubular magazine. Not many, but
Yeah, but one's enough.
Yeah, well, exactly, one's enough. And, you know, this judgment had to be made back in 1860-61. One of Ripley's critics, a guy that Fred Shannon in 1928 says, oh, well, Ripley, he was concerned about bullets going off in the magazines. It never happened. Well, he knew that in 1928. Ripley didn't know that in 1861. So some of those conservative fears that they had were, I think, somewhat justifiable. He did err inside of caution, no question about it. Yes, Harold?
Was dirt a big problem in the Civil War with these arms? Dirt?
Dirt, oh,
Your
God,
rifle,
yeah. Oh, my God, yeah.
You're carving dirt, I mean, that had to be a big issue,
Oh,
right?
it was, and the barrel, you'll read stories of different battles where the guys have been firing there, like there's 60 rounds of ammunition, and before they got them all fired, the fouling was so bad in the barrel that they were putting a ramrod in and banging up against a tree or a stone fence or anything to get that bullet down. So the dirt and powder corrosion was a very big problem.
Which was the case till smokeless powder came along.
Yeah, it didn't have, and that was another reason why we stayed with the black powder cartridge 4570s so long, is simply we couldn't get. DuPont was trying to figure out how to manufacture smokeless, and Europeans wouldn't sell us any more than just an experimental amount. So we couldn't get enough smokeless powder to adopt until we finally adopted the Craig Jorgensen in 18.
No, I think that was black powder also. I think the 03 was the first smokeless powder.
No, the Craig used smokeless. Matter of fact, that was one of the things in the Spanish-American War, when we had volunteer units from different states. They didn't have, there weren't enough Craig Jorgensens to arm everybody. So the regular army had the Craig Jorgensen, but the state units like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and so on, they were still going to war with the muzzle loading, or not, I'm sorry, muzzle, but the black powder cartridge 4570 trap door. And they'd be firing, and the Spanish could see a row of white smoke over there. And of course, they knew exactly where to drop the bomb.
Tom, at the conclusion of many battles, Confederate soldiers were always looking for new weapons to recover on the battlefield. Is there any research that indicates if you were a Confederate soldier, the battle is over, and you know that there are dead and wounded Union soldiers out there, what was your favorite weapon that you might look for?
I would think.
The first one you found.
Got to be the first one.
Anyone that works.
I would kind of think maybe they would have preferred the Enfield since they were important. But certainly they wouldn't. I don't think it would have passed up a Springfield either. Now there's an interesting story. At the end of the peninsula, after Malvern Hill, the Confederacy picked up quite a quantity of Union arms. Of course, it was generally the Ordnance Corps that did this. I'm sure individual soldiers went out and said, oh, there's a better gun, I'll pick it up. But it's generally the Ordnance Corps that went out, picked these guns up, cleaned them up a little bit and so on. And they had a number of Union arms that were captured. But one South Carolina regiment chose not to adopt it. They wanted to keep the gun that they had, which was an imported European arm. It was one of the, at this point I can't remember, it was not one of the Austrian or Belgian arms. But they decided to keep, now we don't want to change. So there are exceptions, you know, where the Confederate troops kind of like what they had. And in the New Jersey troops, I think on the one paperback I passed around with the granite picture of the granite mini ball on there. That was to the 7th New Jersey. And even by the time of the Gettysburg, they were still carrying smoothbores. So some units kind of like the. Personally, I think that at the range that the average Civil War battle was fought, 125 yards, or many of the battles were fought well under 100 yards. The smoothbore was perfectly adequate when you're shooting at that close range. have a musket ball and 3 buckshot. So you had the kind of like the benefit of a small shotgun. And then you did numerous wounds with that. That was a pretty good war. They used to call it, for some reason, I don't know what the background, they call it 3 cheers and a tagger. That's what they referred to that fucking ball. Where that term comes from, I'm not really sure. Right.
I think Teddy Roosevelt referenced in the Spanish-American War, in his book, The Rough Riders, all the black powder flying out on the U.S. side versus the clean Mausers that the Spanish were shooting back at them.
Yeah.
You never answered completely one of my early questions. What were the French using as a standard weapon at this time? Had they gone to a bolt action? I'm pretty sure they have one by 1870 when they took on the Germans.
Yeah, during our American Civil War, what the French had, I top of my head, I can't tell you, but by 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, they were using what was called the chassepot, named after the guy, the French designer. It was a bolt-action weapon, and it was better than what the Germans were using. Here again, a case where the better arm doesn't always necessarily guarantee an outcome of victory. The Prussian army were still using the Drace bolt action, but the French chassepot arm was much better. But the Germans beat them because they had better artillery and better overall organization of their.
From what I can tell, every time they went head to head, the French shot a lot of Germans, but what the Germans simply then would go around the flanks and surround the French.
But for rifle to rifle, the French were using, and even the Germans admitted, the French had a better army rifle in the Franco-Prussian War than what the Germans did. But just in conclusion, now of course I'll answer any question you have, but in conclusion, the machine tools kind of carried the seeds of their own destruction. Because once they had this great investment in machine tools to manufacture the Civil War musket, they were reluctant to go to anything new because they had such an investment in machine tools. So by 1884, here's a walk from a weapon model 1884, and you'll notice there's not a whole lot of difference between this lock. I can pass it around if you like, but it's getting a little late. There's not a whole lot of difference between the parts in this lock as there was in the 1852 musket I passed around 34 years earlier. And the reason for that was they had all the machines to make these springs and so on, and they really didn't want to give up on the investment they had in those machine tools. So we carried, probably didn't matter for the time we were just fighting Indians, so it probably didn't matter too much. But we were carrying a rather obsolete arm in the American Army for a long, long time. A lot of good arms were proposed, and they'd have a commission, they'd look at them, and they'd stick with the trapdoor musket. So, and then mainly, and well, there are a lot of other reasons too, but one of the big reasons was they had such an investment in the tools that made these parts that they wanted to continue with. Any other questions or things that you may? Yes. Oh, okay.
Did they have, sorry, is it sufficient to say that the North had an adequate supply of skilled craftsmen that could do this?
Yes, yes. One of the things, and I'll just give you I say, what Ripley had to do, and he only had one armory, to increase production. Of course, he went to 2 shifts. Everybody worked a 10-hour shift in those days, and he brought in more machine tools. As I said earlier, to manufacture an average number of 15,000 arms of the Civil War model required over 500 machine tools. Now, in 1860, Springfield manufactured 10,000 arms. So even though they could have had tools to make 15,000 a year, they didn't need 15,000. They made but 10,000 in 1860. In 1861, the first year of the war, they were only able to increase production to 12,000. But by the end of 1862, Springfield Armory produced 100,000 arms. By 1863, they produced 278,200 arms. That was the year they got rid of poor old Ripley, but he must have been doing something correct to get that kind of production up in Springfield Armory. 1864, they only produced 200,000. 1865, the last year of the war, ended in April, their production was 30,000. And in 1866, they made 3,000 arms. So you sort of see the production rates that varied, but I think it's kind of a testimony that they were able to provide adding more machine tools, expanding the facilities, going to several shifts, they increased production quite a bit. And there again, if they had gone to, comparable, Spencer's manufacturing facility, he bought out the Chickering Piano Factory in Boston, which was like a 3-story building, sort of took up half a block. That was his manufacturing facility. Springfield Armory took up acres. Harper's Ferry took up acres. So there's really hard to believe that, that we could have adopted a different kind of an arm and manufactured them enough in quantity to have armed the Union Army.
Would a modern comparison maybe being comparing, say, a Barrett sniper rifle and that line of weapons to, say, the M16? Barrett's done on such a smaller scale for specialized.
Yeah, we don't need, we don't how many snipers do we have and how many weapons do we really need. So, yeah, they can, in that small facility, they can supply all the sniper rifles that the Army and the Marine Corps really need. But they can never, somebody said, we're going to give everybody in the Army a Barrett. Well, no, they probably couldn't manufacture them.
He sure as heck have the Geneva folks upset. 50 cals are supposed to be anti-vehicle weapons, not anti-personnel.
Quite an arm. I just got an email or somebody, it was a Canadian sniper, made a kill over a mile and a half.
All right.
Yeah, Afghanistan, I think.
Yeah, it's quite an arm. It's an awful lot too small. Reach out and touch something. Yes, sir.
You didn't have the opportunity to discuss Reading Connection.
Oh. I don't know if we have to get out of here at 3 o'clock, but I did want to mention the Reading connection. Here in Reading, you had a foundry known as the Cipher McManus Foundry. McManus was a fellow who came from Ireland, born in Ireland, came over here to the United States, and it was a typical Horatio Alger story. Found opportunity, found that his intelligence and his entrepreneurship would pay off, and he got into railroads and so on. He married a girl named Cipher from here in Reading, and her father was in business with another man, whose name I can't recall. But then Cipher and his son-in-law McManus founded the Cipher McManus Foundry. And I understand there's still a number of buildings here in Reading that go back to that foundry and some of their operations. I'm not well enough acquainted with Reading to kind of tell you where they were.
They're the Luton's plant.
Okay. But they cast quite a bit of armament for the Union Army, smaller calibers, machines, artillery shells and so on. But they also were able to cast very, very, very large naval coastal defense guns of 15-inch caliber. And they cast it on what was known as the Rodman principle. Thomas Jefferson Rodman, an ordnance officer, came up with the technique of casting a cannon hollow. The traditional way was to cast a cannon and then bore it out. But when you had that, you had this big mass of iron that had to cool from the inside out. And the outer shell would cool and harden, and then as the heat tried to escape through there, it developed fissures in the cast iron, so that when you would fire, even though in the proof test it wouldn't burst, but sometimes after 60, 70, 75 rounds, these guns would shatter. And Rodman came up with the idea of, since we're casting such large bores, you put a steel tube down, and in that steel tube he had water pipes, and he pumped cold water into the interior of the barrel and siphoned it off, so that the gun cooled from the outside in, and as it cooled, it put greater and greater pressure on the bore of the gun. And it was a much more reliable type of a cannon. It took a very large foundry to be able to do that. These guns are made either up by the Owlser foundry in Boston, the Fort Pitt foundry in Pittsburgh, and by Seifert McManus foundry here in Reading. I would imagine, I don't know, I would imagine they must have tested them somewhere along the Schuylkill River, but I can't imagine them taking a cannon down to 5th and Penn and shooting it down. To make sure it didn't fall all the time. I figure they must have had some kind of facility now.
Would have been awkward if the shot would have come short. Blown the edge off already.
And that kind of ties in with the question that I asked earlier about the naval gun that wiped out half of Don Tyler's cabinet there. Just with cast iron artillery was just very, very tricky material to work with. And gun rupture, or how you call it. All right, if there's any other questions, I'm glad to try and answer. Otherwise, I guess we've come to the end of our time here. I enjoyed myself. I hope